The tithe, or as I'd like to call it in this series, presenting. I'll explain why. Acts Churches is the movement that we belong to, and we have 11 tenets or statements of belief. And one of those reads like this. It says, we believe, and each minister upholds these, the privilege and responsibility of wise stewardship of all God is given, including the practice of tithing to the local church. Let me start by saying that a tithe is 1/10. 1/10 of our increase to the local church. The biblical pattern is that the tithe is brought to the storehouse, which is the local church. Now, I know tithing creates a lot of questions for people, but over the next couple of segments, I want to unpack it a bit so that you get some understanding, because I absolutely believe to my core that tithing is what connects us to heaven's economy. We see the practice of tithing many times throughout the scripture. In fact, it starts really early on. It starts about Genesis 14, where it starts before that actually, but the first significant one we see is Genesis 14, where Abraham brings a tithe to the priest Melchizedek. And that is before the Mosaic law is in place. That is a response of gratitude from Abraham. Then we see tithing all the way through the Old Testament. We read about it a lot. We see it a lot. We're instructed on it a lot, what it means. And then, so some would say, look, tithing is an Old Testament practice and that's where it needs to stay. But this is incorrect, because when you move into the New Testament, it almost assumes that tithing is a practice we now understand and we practice. Matthew 23 is a great example of that. From verse 23, it says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, you Pharisees, hypocrites." Jesus was having a good go at them here. "For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from the herb garden." So it's just assumed there that they are tithing. In Luke 14, it talks about Jesus in the synagogue, and we know that just a normal part of a Jew's life was to go to synagogue, and part of that was to tithe. It's just a normal part of life, not even worth mentioning hardly in the New Testament. In fact, the New Testament goes to a whole new level. It says give everything, where a tithe is 1/10. Should we tithe? Yes, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. As I said, it connects us to heaven's economy. Are we cursed if we don't tithe? No. Don't let anyone pop that in your spirit. That's scaremongering. No, we're not cursed if we don't tithe. However, I would say this. Have you ever tried to download something on the internet if you're not connected to the internet? That makes no sense, does it? It simply does not work. If tithing connects us to heaven's economy, why would we try to live any other way? The tithe is an important part of our faith journey, because it means we've got faith in God that He is our supply and He will meet our needs. From heaven's perspective, the tithe has always been intended to finance the basic operations of the church. It's always been this way. You go to scripture, you see it all the way through. It transforms as culture transforms, but it starts, the tithe goes to the priest, then to the tabernacle, then to the temple, then to the synagogue, then to the church. It's simply God's method of funding the church and the basic operations of the church. Therefore, I believe you can be a believer and not tithe, but if you're a dedicated disciple of Jesus and want to live according to His patterns, it includes tithing. It's just something we need to learn and something we need to do. Tithing is not giving. That is a mistake or a misunderstanding that a lot of people make. But tithing is not giving. Tithing is simply giving back to God what is already His. That's why I've called it presenting in this series. We're presenting back to God what is already His. Great move of trust on His behalf. He says, look, I'll give you all this, believing that you'll give back to me, so then I can then bless the other 90%. The tithing, it's a bit of a test, I think, of our faith in that regard, but it was never ours. It's always God's. Always God's. That's why Malachi talks about the fact that people were stealing from God by not giving their tithes. If it was a gift and I don't give it, that's not stealing, that's just withholding a gift. But if it's a tithe, if it already belongs to God, I don't give it to Him, therefore I'm stealing it. That's what Malachi is talking about. The issue becomes fairly simple in my mind. It's just this: will we return to God what is His? I hope the answer is yes. Jesus' sacrifice did away with the curse, did away with the penalties that were talked about. He fulfilled all of that. But the tithe is still the connector to heaven's economy, because that's simply how God works. The 10% returned attracts God's blessing on the other 90%. I've proved that in my life so many times. When I wasn't tithing regularly, like I feel I should have been, interesting, I think my life costs went up, my living costs, my repair costs and everything probably cost me more than 10%. But I'm a firm believer that as I give to God, that 10%, he blesses the 90%. And I believe that means my shoes last longer, my clothes last longer, my car doesn't break down, all those kind of things. I've got faith for that. Tithing is essentially our answer to this question. Do I believe that God is my provider, or do I believe that I'm my provider? Tithing and our response to our tithing answers that question. Our response to doing it God's way answers the question. We either tithe or we don't. We put our faith in our own ability, or we put our faith in God's ability. Again, God set the whole thing up. He put it in place. He made the rules, set the patterns, the methods. I want to put my faith in his ways, not in my ways. The tithe, the first 10% belongs to God. This means, as I said, I do not give it to him. I simply return it to him. So a tithe is 10% of our gain. Actually, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees because they got really picky about all that. They just took it way too far, got really legalistic, when the main focus should have been wherever, whenever, been like Jesus. They were just stuck on things like tithing, but he never once said, oh, you don't need to tithe or stop tithing. He just said, don't make that your biggest deal. Get on with it. The tithe is generally, in today's society, 10% of our salary or of our wages or of the profit of a business or whatever it is. But can I just warn you against this? Some people treat tithing like a tax. Tithing's not a tax. It's a response. It's a joy to give it back. Don't treat it like a tax. Treat it like an opportunity, like a privilege to give back to God what is his. Often the next question asked after should I be tithing is, so do I tithe before or after tax, net or gross? Well, I'm not even going to answer that question. I just think it's a issue of conscience. You can decide. You pray. You ask God what he wants you to do and do what he asks you to do, because obedience is important. But I will say this much. If we can't embrace the practice of tithing when we have little, you won't embrace it when you have more. So fooling ourselves that we don't have enough to tithe never works. If we can't embrace it when we've got more, we simply won't embrace it when we've got little. We certainly won't embrace it when we've got more. The practice of tithing is acknowledging that God is our supplier and I'm not the supplier. And again, the tithe connects us with heaven's economies. Funny that, He designed it and it works. Let me just give you this thought to ponder about. Am I doing it God's way? See you next time.